Creativists, for example, believe that much of our human behaviour is due to our genes, or is behaviour which is adaptive or evolutionary. Empiricists, on the other hand, believe that much of our behaviour is learnt through our experience. Interactionists tend to view behaviour as a combination of genes and our environment. So how can we investigate if certain perceptual abilities are innate or if they're learned? So what is perception? Have a look at the Necker cube here. Imagine that the yellow square is at the top of the cube. Just do that for a moment. Now imagine that the yellow square is at the back of the cube. You can use the red dot to change your perception of this cube from one to the other. Eventually, you'll be able to change the orientation of the cube at will. So you see the yellow square at the top, or you can see the yellow square at the back of the cube. Have a look at this next picture. When you look at this picture straight away, do you see a young woman with her head turned to the side, or do you see an old lady? This again shows how we can change our perception at will. So it's not necessarily what we see, but how we perceive what we see that's important. Gibson and Walk's experiment is about depth perception and our ability to perceive that things are either closer or further away, particularly whether this ability is innate, inborn, in other words, or learned through experience. So how do we perceive depth? Well, there are different cues that we can look for. There are binocular cues. You can use a pen test to see binocular cues and how our two eyes work together. Hold a pen up in front of your eyes at a close distance. Now look at the position of the pen in relation to its background, with one eye closed and then the other eye closed. Notice how the pen changes position depending on which eye you're looking at it with. If it's very close, the position of the pen compared to the background will change significantly. If it's far away, it will hardly change at all. This is one of the ways that our brain can tell the distance of certain objects. There are other cues as well, such as if one object is obscuring another, then we can see that certain objects are in the background. We can tell also by the relative size of objects and also how we see texture and gradient. So for example, things in the distance will look smoother than things which are close up. We can also use motion parallax, which is basically how quickly things pass across our field of vision. If they're very close, when we move our heads, they will pass by quite quickly. If they're in the distance, they will pass by quite slowly. You can try this experiment by just getting two pencils and holding them at arm's length away from your body. Close one eye and try to bring the points of the pencils together so that the points touch each other. You can see that we use both eyes to perceive distance, and with one eye closed it's much more difficult. I'll show you an experiment. I'll show you a demonstration of this. You can see with this picture that the smaller pyramids are in the foreground because they are partially obscuring the larger pyramids in the background. So this is what we call monocular depth cues. With this picture, what we actually perceive is two-dimensional. We see it as three-dimensional because the road is disappearing into a vanishing point. This picture is interesting because we have size constancy. We have the ability to perceive size as unchanging despite changes of the size of the image on our retina. For example, the man in the background is only about a quarter of the size of the man in the foreground. We don't perceive him as a tiny little man. We perceive him as just further away. Okay, so perception with two eyes is really easy. Look. Two ends of the pen together. Simple. Now look what happens when I try to do it with one eye closed. Have a good laugh. Down. Other eye. Down. Did it in the end. You can have a go at that. It's very simple. Just get two pens, close one eye, see if you can get the two ends together. So the aims of Gibson and Walk's experiment were to investigate if depth perception is learned through experience or whether it's present from birth. If depth perception is innate, then it should be apparent by the time infants are able to move independently. We would expect, for example, that a young infant would not crawl off a steep drop because they would instinctively know that the distance to the bottom was too far and it would be dangerous. Humans are not mobile until about 6 months old, so the problem with this kind of experiment is that the results can be a bit inconclusive. A child who could perceive depth at 6 months may have always been able to do this. That would be a nativist position, or they may have learnt to do that in the last 6 months since their birth, which would be an empiricist position. Gibson and Walk decided then to not only use human infants from 6 months old, they decided to use a range of different non-human animals: kids, baby goats, lambs, rats, turtles, chicks and kittens. As some of these animals can walk from birth, this would then provide more evidence about whether depth perception is innate. Ah, cute. So, who were the participants and what were the procedures? 36 babies were used aged between 6 months and 14 months old. Their mothers also had to take part in the experiment. All the babies were able to crawl. Some non-human animals were used as well. These included chicks, lambs and kids who were mobile at 1 day old, kittens mobile at 4 weeks old, kittens that had been reared in the dark for 27 days. This prevented them from having learnt any depth cues before they were tested. They also tested rats that are mobile at 4 weeks old. Some of them wore hoods so that they could only use their whiskers for cues rather than any visual cues. A further group of rats were reared in the dark before being tested. Pigs, dogs and aquatic turtles were also used. Gibson and Walk had to set up an experimental situation that would provide the visual representation of a steep drop, in other words, a visual cliff, without actually putting the infants in any danger. The experiment was conducted at Cornell University in the USA. So here on the PowerPoint you can see a diagram of the experimental setup. You can see a better representation of it on page 111 in your textbook. So essentially what they did is they created this visual cliff by using a glass-topped table that could safely support the weight of each infant. A check-patterned tablecloth was positioned beneath the glass on one side of the table. That formed the shallow side, and 4 feet below the glass on the other side, which formed the deep side. This gives the impression of a steep drop at one end of the table, which they called the visual cliff. Here you can see a picture of a young baby placed on the table just in front of the deep side or the visual cliff. The question that Gibson and Walk wanted to know was, would young infants and baby animals crawl across the visual cliff to reach their mothers, or would they be put off by the look of the cliff, the steep drop, and then just crawl onto the shallow side? If they avoid the steep drop or the visual cliff, this would suggest that their depth perception is intact and therefore possibly innate. There are a couple of other interesting details that you should know. For example, it was thought that perhaps the glass over the deep side created some kind of a reflection which might have given the babies a clue that there was solid glass there instead of a drop. So to remove this possible extraneous variable, Gibson and Walk lit the pattern from underneath the glass rather than light shining down on top of it. Another interesting way that they were able to remove other possible depth cues so that they could just test depth perception alone was by using the pattern on the checkered cloth. The pattern would provide a depth cue because at the bottom of the steep drop the checks would be smaller, just as we were talking about size constancy a moment ago. On the shallow side, the checks would be larger, which would indicate to the child that they were closer. So to remove these possible cues, to just test depth perception, Gibson and Walk made the pattern on the shallow side and the deep side the same size. In other words, they had to adjust the size of the checks to make them identical on the shallow side and the deep side. This would give the illusion of them being closer. So what were the results of Gibson and Walk's experiment? How many infants do you think moved across the deep side? How many of the baby animals moved? Well, you can have a look at the detailed findings on page 112 of your textbook. Essentially, 27 of the infant babies moved off the centre board. All of them crawled onto the shallow side. Only 3 of the babies attempted to move onto the deep side. Many of the infants crawled away from their mothers, even when their mothers called to them from the deep side. The look of the steep drop was enough to put them off crawling across, even when they could feel and patted the glass with their hands. What does this suggest to you? Does it mean that depth perception is innate? What about the baby animals? You can have a look at the detailed findings, but in the main part, the baby animals also showed preference for the shallow side. Some animals, such as kittens and the lambs and kids, were placed onto the deep side directly. When this happened, the animals froze. Some of them would revert back to the shallow side as quickly as possible. So what conclusions can we draw about the nature and nurture debate? This experiment seems to suggest that young infants can discriminate depth as soon as they can crawl. Some of them did back onto the deep side, however, meaning that you still probably shouldn't leave a baby close to a cliff edge. In terms of nature or nurture, it's still possible that these 6-month-old babies could have learnt depth perception in their first 6 months of life. Therefore, can we draw absolute conclusions about nature or nurture? So, make sure that you have written full notes on the procedures and the findings of Gibson and Walk's experiment. Look at page 111 and 112 in your textbook. Pay attention to the way that Gibson and Walk tested how infants use particular depth cues, in particular motion parallax, and how they altered the checkered pattern to test for that. Make sure that you've finished your notes and that you have all the details there. In class, we will look more at the context of the study and also evaluate the study in more depth. Cheerio!